Hello, everyone. Let's have a radical dive into the work of Emma Goldman. Keep it radical, keep it revolutionary. Today, we're going to be looking at Emma Goldman. You know, she was a true revolutionary firebrand of the late 19th and early 20th
Oh,
century.
yeah, her ideas are as fiery and relevant today as they were back then.
Exactly. And to help us understand her radical views, we've got a collection of her essays on women and emancipation. Plus, we've got some modern analyses, too. All of this is going to help us to really understand her views on love, marriage, sexuality, and women's liberation.
It's fascinating how Goldman's ideas, often considered radical for her time, they still resonate with many of the debates we're having today.
Okay, so let's unpack this. One of the things that really struck me was Goldman's view of anarchy. For her, it wasn't just a political ideology, it was like a way of life, a force for constant transformation. She even connected it to sexuality. It's like she saw anarchy as this vibrant, pulsating energy that runs through everything.
Yes, and that's what she called vitality. It's the life force itself. And for Goldman, it was inextricably linked to sexuality. She felt that societal institutions were always trying to control and repress these natural human impulses,
Yeah.
especially sexual desire.
She even quoted Walt Whitman, saying, "These are all contained in sex as parts of itself and justifications of itself." Wow, right.
Right. For Goldman, anarchy was about breaking free from those constraints, those attempts to bottle up our natural energy and vitality.
It's like she was saying, let's tear down the walls and let life flow.
Yeah.
Now, that's radical. You know, she also called for a complete transvaluation of all accepted values, which sounds a lot like Nietzsche, who she was deeply influenced by.
Absolutely.
So for those who don't know,
You might be familiar with Nietzsche, the philosopher known for his ideas about challenging conventional morality. Goldman was drawn to his concept of transvaluation of all values, which essentially means questioning everything we take for granted as good or bad. She felt society was trapped in these outdated morals, especially around sexuality. And she felt these outdated morals were actually stifling our vitality.
so it's not just about breaking free from political systems, but from these ingrained ways of thinking that hold us back. And this idea really comes through in her essay, The Tragedy of Woman's Emancipation. In this essay, Goldman argued that true emancipation wasn't just about external freedoms like voting rights, but a deeper internal liberation.
Exactly. True emancipation for Goldman was about freeing ourselves from societal expectations and ingrained prejudices, particularly those imposed on women. And she saw so many emancipated women just replicating the same restrictive patterns they were supposedly fighting against. It's like they were given this tiny taste of freedom, but were still trapped in a cage of societal expectations.
And it breaks my heart because she uses these powerful examples of brilliant women who achieved great things, but still struggled to find true fulfillment. There's Eleanor Dudus, the renowned actress, Sonja Kovalovskaja, the brilliant mathematician, and Marie Bashkirtsev, the gifted artist and writer.
Yeah. These were all extraordinary women who pushed boundaries, but they still couldn't escape those limiting societal norms. That dictated how a woman should live and love.
So they were emancipated in some ways, but still profoundly confined in others. Makes you wonder, what does true liberation actually look like?
That's the question Goldman was grappling with, and here's where it gets really interesting. She believed a woman's freedom is inextricably linked to a man's freedom. True liberation, for her, required breaking down the artificial dualism between the sexes. This wasn't just about women, it was about all of humanity.
Wow, that is radical. So let's talk about another one of Goldman's hot-button topics, marriage. She was not a fan, calling it an economic arrangement. More of an insurance pact than a true expression of love.
She went even further, arguing that marriage made a parasite of woman. I know that sounds harsh, but to understand what she meant, we have to remember the social and economic context of the early 20th century. At that time, women were largely dependent on men for financial survival. Marriage was often seen as a woman's only path to security.
So Goldman was saying that marriage, instead of being about love and partnership, was often about economic dependency, which could stifle a woman's potential.
Exactly. She felt that marriage, in many cases, robbed women of their social consciousness and prevented them from fully developing their talents and contributing to the world.
She also had some sharp words for how marriage could turn love into a transaction, particularly for women. It often trapped them in a cycle of unwanted pregnancies and economic dependence. It's like she saw this dark side of marriage that people didn't want to talk about.
Right, and this ties directly to Goldman's views on motherhood. She believed that forcing women into motherhood through societal pressure and lack of access to birth control was deeply unjust.
She envisioned motherhood thriving in an atmosphere of love and freedom, not compulsion. which feels so relevant even today.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that Goldman wasn't against love or relationships. She wasn't saying all marriages were bad.
Yeah.
She believed in a love that defied laws and conventions, a force so powerful it could transform even the poorest hovel into a radiant space.
She saw love as this wild, untamable force. Now that's an image that sticks with you. And speaking of defying conventions, she had a lot to say about Puritanism. She saw it as a force that suppressed natural human impulses and created a breeding ground for hypocrisy and vice.
She was especially critical of American Puritanism, arguing that its obsession with repressing sexuality had a stifling effect on everything, from art and literature to the simple enjoyment of a Sunday.
She even said that by trying to control people's natural desires, they actually created the very problems they claimed to be solving. She argued that the obsession with repressing sexuality actually led to an increase in prostitution and venereal diseases.
Yeah.
It's like she was saying, look, you can't just sweep these things under the rug. You have to deal with them openly and honestly.
And that's exactly what she advocated for. Goldman believed in open and honest discussion of sexual matters and fought for access to contraception, which was radical for her time. She even faced legal battles and imprisonment for distributing birth control information.
Wow, she was fearless. Now, there's another really fascinating idea she explored. Jealousy. She didn't see it as an inherent human emotion, but rather a symptom of societal conditioning, especially the possessiveness ingrained in institutions like marriage.
Yeah, this raises an important question about the nature of love and relationships. She saw jealousy as a destructive force, diminishing both individuals and the relationship itself. She believed that those who truly loved their partners would allow them the freedom to explore their desires and emotions without trying to control them.
So basically she was saying, if you truly love someone, you trust them and give them the freedom to be themselves.
Exactly. And she wasn't necessarily advocating for non-monogamy for everyone. It was more about challenging this idea that love equals possessiveness and control. She believed in a more expansive, trusting kind of love.
It's about letting go of the fear and embracing the beauty of a truly free and equal relationship.
And this brings us to another area where Goldman was a tireless advocate.
Yeah.
Birth control. She saw it as essential not just for women's liberation, but for workers' rights and the well-being of children.
She truly believed access to contraception could help women reclaim their bodies, their reproductive choices, and ultimately their freedom. And she didn't just talk about it, she took action. Remember the story of Mrs. Schnur?
Yes, Mrs. Schnur was a woman driven to theft to feed her 6 children. It was a tragic example of how lack of access to birth control could devastate families and perpetuate cycles of poverty. Goldman saw access to contraception as a key to breaking these cycles.
She saw the impact on families, on women's health, on their ability to work and contribute to society. She even went to jail for her beliefs, showing just how committed she was to breaking down the barriers to reproductive freedom. I think it's easy to forget how revolutionary her ideas were for her time. She was truly ahead of her time in so many ways.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that Goldman's activism wasn't limited to just women's issues. She saw these struggles as deeply interconnected with broader social and economic justice movements.
And this brings us to a topic that might seem surprising given her passion for women's rights. Her stance on the suffrage movement, she was actually quite critical of it, seeing it as a potential distraction from more fundamental issues of social and economic equality.
This might seem counterintuitive, but Goldman believed that simply gaining the right to vote wouldn't magically liberate women. She felt that focusing on suffrage could even reinforce existing power structures and distract from the need for more radical systemic change. It's not that she didn't believe in women's right to vote, it's that she felt it wasn't enough.
She even went so far as to criticize the English suffragettes who abandoned their pacifist principles to support World War I.
Yeah, she saw it as betrayal of their ideals and proof that women in power could be just as susceptible to corruption as men. It really underscores her commitment to challenging conventional wisdom, even within progressive movements.
She was willing to question whether a particular tactic, even one widely seen as positive, would truly lead to the kind of profound change she envisioned. That takes real courage and intellectual honesty.
It certainly does. And speaking of challenging conventional wisdom, Goldman also had a lot to say about how history is interpreted and how we categorize individuals. A fascinating example of this is her defense of Louise Michel, a fellow anarchist and close friend.
Ah, yes, Louise Michel. A true revolutionary figure. Tell us more about what happened.
Well, a contemporary writer named Carl von Lewitzau tried to classify Michel as a lesbian. Based on her unconventional lifestyle and close relationships with women, it was an attempt to fit her into a neat little box. And Goldman wasn't having it.
I can only imagine her reaction.
She was furious. She saw von Levitz's analysis as rooted in narrow, stereotypical views of femininity and masculinity. She argued that Michelle was a complete woman, a revolutionary spirit who defied categorization.
It's so important to remember that people are complex and defy easy labels, especially individuals like Michelle who live such extraordinary lives.
Exactly. And Goldman argued that Michelle's legacy should be celebrated for its complexity and defiance of societal norms, not reduced to simplistic labels.
It's a powerful reminder that how we interpret history
Yeah.
and whose voices we choose to amplify can either reinforce existing power structures or create space for more nuanced and inclusive understandings of the past.
A point worth pondering, especially in our current era of information overload and competing narratives.
Now, one thing that surprised me was learning about Goldman's own marriage later in life. It seemed a bit ironic, given her strong critiques of the institution.
It's easy to assume she had a change of heart. But Goldman clarified that her marriage was a strategic move, a way to navigate the increasingly restrictive world she was living in. She was basically using the system to protect her privacy and freedom.
So she didn't actually change her views on marriage.
Exactly. She still believed love should be free from state interference, and that the union of two people was a private matter. Think of it like obtaining a passport or visa. Sometimes you have to play the game to get what you need.
It's a reminder that even the most radical individuals sometimes have to make pragmatic choices to survive and continue their work.
Indeed. And it shows that actions can be complex and even contradictory, defying easy categorization. Which brings us to another one of Goldman's fascinating subjects: prostitution.
Oh yes, she had a lot to say about that.
Right.
And it wasn't what you'd expect. She wrote an essay titled The White Slave Traffic, where she argued that prostitution wasn't simply a moral failing, but a symptom of a much deeper societal problem.
It's true. Instead of judging the women involved, she pointed to the economic exploitation that forced many into prostitution out of sheer necessity. She talked about low wages and lack of opportunities for women, especially immigrant women.
And she called out the hypocrisy of those who condemned prostitution, while turning a blind eye to the conditions that created it. It's so easy to point fingers and blame individuals, but she was trying to get people to look at the bigger picture.
Exactly. She highlighted the role of ignorance and societal repression around sexuality in perpetuating prostitution. Remember, this was a time when even talking about sex was taboo.
So by suppressing open discussion about sexuality, society was actually making the problem worse. She believed that if women were empowered with knowledge about their bodies and sexuality, they'd be less vulnerable to exploitation.
It's a point that's still relevant today. We see how the lack of comprehensive sex education can leave people vulnerable to exploitation and abuse.
It's all connected. The economic conditions, the societal norms, the lack of education. It's not just about individual choices. It's about the systems that constrain those choices.
Precisely. And Goldman was brilliant at connecting those dots. She was saying that true morality wasn't about punishing people for their circumstances, but about creating a society where everyone had the opportunity to thrive.
It's like she was asking, what kind of world are we creating? And how can we do better?
And she wasn't afraid to challenge the status quo, even when it came to movements that were seen as progressive.
That's what makes her so interesting. She was always pushing people to think deeper, to look beyond the surface. It wasn't enough to just accept things as they were, even if they were labeled as good or progressive. Like, take her critique of traditional marriage and love, for example.
Right. She called marriage an economic arrangement, more of an insurance pact than a genuine expression of love. She felt it often turned women into parasites, stifling their potential and robbing them of their social consciousness.
I mean, that's a pretty strong statement. But I get what she's saying. If you think about the historical context, women were expected to be wives and mothers, first and foremost. Their own ambitions and desires often took a back seat.
Exactly. And she wasn't just talking about financial dependence. She felt that women were pressured to conform to certain roles and expectations within marriage that limited their intellectual and emotional growth. They were expected to be submissive, to prioritize their husband's needs over their own.
And I imagine that extended to their sexuality as well. A woman's sexuality was often seen as something to be controlled, something that belonged to her husband.
Absolutely. And this gets to the heart of Goldman's critique. She believed that true love and genuine relationships couldn't exist within these suffocating, unequal power dynamics.
It's almost like she's saying that traditional marriage, at least as it existed in her time, was a form of oppression, even if it was disguised as love and security.
That's a great way to put it. And she was bold enough to suggest that maybe marriage wasn't the only path to love and fulfillment. She pointed out that people could experience love and intimacy in various ways outside of conventional societal norms.
So was she suggesting alternative forms of relationships, like open relationships or something like that?
It's not that she was prescribing a specific type of relationship. She was more interested in challenging the idea that there was only one right way to love and be in a relationship.
So she was more about expanding the possibilities, breaking free from those limiting societal scripts.
Exactly. Now, on the topic of breaking free from limitations, let's not forget her groundbreaking work on jealousy. She had such a unique perspective on this, arguing that jealousy wasn't an inherent human emotion, but a symptom of social conditioning.
This part really blew my mind. It makes you question everything you thought you knew about love and relationships.
Right. She connected jealousy to the possessiveness ingrained in institutions like marriage. She felt that people who truly loved and respected their partners wouldn't try to control their affections or actions, but would allow them the freedom to explore their desires and emotions.
So she was basically saying that true love is about trust, respect, and giving each other the space to grow.
Yes. For Goldman, jealousy was more about insecurity and fear of loss than about true love.
And she advocated for a more open and trusting approach to love, one that embraced individual freedom and autonomy.
It was a radical idea, and it still challenges many of the assumptions we hold about romantic love.
I mean, even today, we see so much emphasis on exclusivity and possessiveness in relationships. It's almost like we're conditioned to be jealous.
And she was trying to help us see that those feelings of jealousy, while understandable, are often rooted in these unhealthy societal norms. It's not about blaming ourselves for feeling jealous. It's about recognizing where those feelings come from and trying to move beyond them.
So it's about cultivating emotional maturity and self-awareness within our relationship.
Exactly. Goldman believed that people should strive to overcome their insecurities and fears, rather than letting them dictate their behavior and sabotage their relationships.
It's a powerful message, and I think it speaks to her overall philosophy of embracing freedom and authenticity in every aspect of our lives.
Absolutely. And this brings us back to her critique of societal hypocrisy, which she saw playing out in so many areas, from the condemnation of prostitution, while ignoring the economic conditions that drove women to it, to the suppression of open discussions about sexuality, which only led to more ignorance and harmful outcomes.
She was a master at calling out those double standards and exposing the ways that society punishes individuals for behaviors that are often a result of the very systems that oppress them. It wasn't about blaming individuals. It was about shining a light on the injustices baked into the system.
And she didn't hold back. She wasn't afraid to call out those in positions of power for perpetuating these hypocritical systems.
Whether it was religious leaders, politicians, or even self-proclaimed reformers, she saw through their facades and challenged their authority. She was especially critical of Puritanism and its impact on society.
Right. She felt that Puritanism, with its emphasis on repressing natural human desires, actually created more vice and immorality than it prevented.
She even argued that the strict moral codes of Puritanism, particularly around sexuality, actually led to an increase in prostitution and venereal diseases.
It's almost like she's saying, if you try to suppress something, it's just going to come out in more distorted and harmful ways. It reminds me of that saying, what we resist persists.
Exactly. And she believed that a healthier approach was to acknowledge and address human needs and desires openly and honestly, without shame or judgment.
She saw this as the path to a more just and liberated society.
Speaking of shining a light on the complexities of history, I was really fascinated by her analysis of historical figures like Mary Wollstonecraft.
Yes, Mary Wollstonecraft, the pioneering feminist writer and advocate for women's rights. Goldman was a huge admirer of Wollstonecraft, but she didn't just praise her blindly.
Right. She recognized the complexities and contradictions within her life and legacy, like how Wollstonecraft advocated for women's equality, while also upholding certain traditional views of womanhood.
It's a reminder that even the most radical individuals are shaped by their historical context and personal experiences. And I think that's what makes Goldman's analysis so nuanced and insightful.
She wasn't afraid to delve into the messy, complicated realities of these historical figures. She saw them as human beings with flaws and contradictions, not just icons to be put on a pedestal.
And this leads us to another fascinating case study, her defense of her friend and fellow anarchist, Louise Michel.
She was fiercely loyal to her friends, wasn't she?
She was, and she didn't shy away from defending them, even in the face of public scrutiny. As we mentioned earlier, a writer named Karl von Levitzow tried to classify Michelle as a lesbian, based on her unconventional lifestyle and close relationships with women.
Which, of course, Goldman saw as an attempt to reduce Michelle's complex identity to a simplistic label.
Exactly. She argued that Michelle was a complete woman, a revolutionary spirit who defied categorization, and that her legacy should be celebrated for its complexity and defiance of societal norms.
It's such a powerful reminder that people, especially those who challenge the status quo, are often misrepresented and misunderstood.
And Goldman was committed to pushing back against those simplistic narratives and presenting a more nuanced and truthful understanding of these individuals.
It makes you think about how history is written and whose stories are told. It's a reminder that we need to be critical of the narratives we're presented with and always seek out multiple perspectives.
It's about digging deeper, questioning assumptions, and being open to the complexities and contradictions that make up a life, a movement, or even an entire historical era.
Now, one of the most surprising things I learned about Goldman was that she eventually got married, despite her harsh criticisms of the institution.
It does seem a bit contradictory, doesn't it? But when she explained her reasoning, it made sense. Remember, she said it was a strategic move, a way to navigate the increasingly restrictive world she was living in.
It's like she was saying, I'm not going to let the system dictate how I live my life, but I'm also not going to be naive about how it operates.
Exactly. It shows that even the most radical individuals sometimes have to make pragmatic choices to survive and continue their work.
It's a reminder that navigating life is complex and sometimes requires compromises, even when you have strong ideals.
And that those compromises don't necessarily invalidate your beliefs.
Right. It's about finding a way to live your truth within the constraints of a system. That often works against you. It's a constant balancing act.
And I think Goldman was a master of that balancing act. She was constantly pushing boundaries, challenging conventions, and finding creative ways to live a life that was true to her radical vision.
Speaking of pushing boundaries, I'd love to hear more about her views on societal norms and how they stifle our natural vitality and joy.
That's a great segue. You see, Goldman was really concerned about how societal expectations, especially around gender roles, could lead to a kind of living death.
Okay, now that sounds intense. Tell me more.
She saw this happening to both men and women, but she felt that women, with their limited options and societal pressures, were particularly vulnerable. It was like they were being squeezed into these tiny boxes, told how to behave, how to think, how to feel.
And if they dared to step outside those boxes, they were often punished or ostracized.
Exactly. And she contrasted this stifling existence with the vibrant, passionate lives of those who dared to challenge conventions and live according to their own values and desires.
She was so inspired by those who rebelled, who chose to live fully and authentically, even if it meant facing social disapproval.
Absolutely. And she believed that we all have that potential for aliveness within us. If we're willing to break free from the constraints of societal expectations, it's about embracing our unique paths, even if they lead us off the beaten track.
It's about finding our own dance, so to speak. Remember that famous quote, "If I can't dance, I don't want to be part of your revolution."
Exactly. It's a beautiful metaphor for the kind of radical joy and freedom that Goldman championed. She wasn't just fighting for political change. She was fighting for a world where people could live fully, express themselves authentically, and experience the richness of life in all its messy, glorious complexity.
And I think that's the ultimate takeaway from exploring her work. It's not just about understanding her ideas. It's about finding ways to embody that radical spirit in our own lives.
It's about asking ourselves, how can we break free from the constraints that hold us back and create a world where everyone has the opportunity to dance to the rhythm of their own heart? It's a beautiful vision, isn't it? And she reminds us that this fight for freedom and authenticity is ongoing. It's not something that happened in the past. It's something we have to actively participate in every single day.
Yeah, it's about questioning those inherited norms and expectations, those unwritten rules that tell us how to live, how to love, how to be. And sometimes it's about having the courage to dance to our own rhythm, even if it means stepping out of line.
I love that. Now, before we wrap up, I want to bring us back to one of the core ideas we touched on earlier, Goldman's concept of vitality. Remember how she saw it as this life force, this energy that flows through everything?
Yeah, and how she believed that society, with its puritanical influences, was obsessed with repressing that natural energy, especially when it came to sexuality.
Exactly. She felt that this repression was deeply harmful, leading to all sorts of psychological and social ills. It was like trying to dam a river. You might hold back the water for a while, but eventually it's going to find a way to break free, often in destructive ways.
So instead of trying to suppress those natural impulses, She argued that we should acknowledge and embrace them, channel them in healthy and creative ways. It's about finding ways to let that life force flow freely.
Precisely. She believed that when we deny our natural desires and impulses, we deny a fundamental part of ourselves, and that can lead to a sense of emptiness, a lack of vitality, a feeling of being half alive.
She even called it a living death, didn't she? To be trapped in these routines and roles that don't allow us to fully express ourselves or experience the richness of life.
Exactly. And she saw this happening all around her, people going through the motions, conforming to expectations, but not really living. She saw this as a tragedy, a waste of human potential.
And she contrasted this with the passionate, rebellious lives of those who dared to break free from those constraints. People like Mary Wollstonecraft and Louise Michel, who we talked about earlier, these were women who were fully alive, who embraced both the joys and struggles of life with a fierce intensity.
Yes, and Goldman believed that we all have that potential within us, that spark of defiance, that desire to live authentically. It's about having the courage to break free from the mold and create our own paths.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the radical mind of Emma Goldman, I think the key takeaway for me is this. Don't be afraid to question everything, to challenge those norms and expectations that limit our freedom and vitality.
And to find those things that make us feel truly alive, those things that make us want to dance, even if it means dancing to the beat of our own drum.
Because ultimately, isn't that what a truly radical life is all about?
I think Goldman would agree.